Welcome to Courageous Conversations. Before we start today, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on what always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I thank the Aboriginal people for their custodianship of the land. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal people joining us today. Courageous Conversations encourages individuals, organisations and communities to have conversations that challenge sexist comments, discrimination and disrespectful behaviour. Through these discussions and actions, we can create a culture that is free from rigid gender stereotypes and a community where all men and women and boys and girls feel safe, included and respected. During this program, we encourage you to consider what gender equity and respect means to you and to your community. This is Session 2, Part 2, Where Does Violence Against Women Start?
Welcome back to part 2 of session 2. Okay, so now we want to start to challenge our own beliefs about gender inequality, and we're going to lead off with this question. Gender inequality across society can increase the severity or frequency of violence against women. True or false?
And that inequality comes in a number of levels. It comes in at a structural level, at a society level. The mere fact that women have babies puts them at an incredible disadvantage in terms of equality. Women's careers will be interrupted if they want to have children. It comes at a cultural level as well, with the stereotyping that we spoke about, and then at the personal level of violence that we spoke about. It also goes to the level of equity. And there's a difference between equality, where people receive and are treated the same, and equity, where people are treated fairly. And that is quite different. And the slide on the screen really sums it up, really. The first slide is everyone being treated equally, exactly the same. And sometimes equal is not actually fair. Sometimes you need to actually make adjustments for people in order for them to be treated fairly and to get the same sort of advantage as others. The picture on the right there is a classic example of how that could occur. So to achieve gender equity, both men and women need to be operating on a level playing field that is adaptable to their needs. To be fair, strategies and measures must be available to compensate for women's historical and social disadvantages, especially when it comes to the workplace, especially when it comes to promotion and advancement, especially when it comes to things like superannuation, which has been chopped and started along the way as well. So women leaving a relationship and seeking to start afresh start already behind the financial 8 ball on that basis. Another area of disadvantage.
Yeah, and I think so. What's key to important bits to get out of this is equality is about everyone being equal. Everyone is born the same. But equity is because these social and cultural beliefs, norms have existed historically in our society. We need to ensure that women are given what they need so that it can become a level playing field again. Essentially what's at the core of it. And as Michael was talking about, this particularly plays out in the workplace. We see it in the workplace. So we're going to flick to a video just to highlight what that looks like in the workplace.
Hello, young gentlemen. Take the escalator, please. Thank you very much. Ladies, up the stairs. Thank you. Gents, you can take it. Escalator right to the top. Thank you very much. Ladies, take the stairs, please. Stairs. Gents, take the escalator. Ladies, take the stairs, please. Gents, take the escalator. Ladies, take the stairs, please. If you don't mind. Over here. Go up the escalator. Ladies, take the stairs, please. Thank you very much. Thank you. Gents, go up the escalator if you want. Push up the escalator. Thank you very much. Thank you. Ladies, can you take the stairs, please? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. It's just the way it is, yep. It is. Stairs, please. Thank you very much. Yep, it's just the way it is. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. All right, thank you. Gentlemen, can you take the escalator, please? Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
In 2018, the path to leadership is still too slow. We need more women leaders in London to make our city even more successful. This is our time to support more women from all backgrounds into leadership roles.
So this is an illustration of inequality and inequity, essentially. It does play out in the workplace, but we also see this play out in a number of different areas across our community. What I also was thinking about when I was watching this was how many people don't get on those stairs. And Michael, you were talking before about particular women who stop their career to have a baby, how long they are on that platform to look after children before they have that opportunity again to get back on the stairs, and that process sometimes of having to reinvent your identity before you can get back on the stairs. That's
a really good point, because the video picked up on the fact that you take the stairs or the escalators, but for some people neither is the option. There's a couple of statistics here coming up that will help enforce that and show the effect of that. It shows up in these slides in that women and girls make up just over half of the Australian population, and yet what we see is that they earn between 15 and 19% less than the average male. That's around about $250 a week less than a male at the same sort of level would be earning. 47%, they make up over half the population, but comprise less than half the workforce. When they are working, they earn less than males for the same role. And the incredible number that's worked out there is that women would have to work an extra 56 days a year, 5-day weeks, that's 11 weeks a year extra to get the same level of pay as a man on the same role. Really quite a horrendous figure. Women are more also overrepresented in low-paid industries, social services, healthcare, the human services, massively overrepresented by females, and they're also underpaid in those areas, as the next slide will show as well. Women are also, as we both mentioned, the primary carers of children. So not only are they on parental leave and out of the workforce, but they have a role that denies them the ability to collect superannuation and all the benefits that go with employment, including the status and opportunity to advance. So they'll step out and they'll go back into their role that they had if they were lucky, or into a lower role, probably more possibly.
And not just children, also primary carers of older people and people living with a disability. 95% of primary parental leave outside the public sector is taken by women, and women spend almost 3 times as much time taking care of children each day compared to men. So it's not just in their role in the workforce, but it's also in their role at home.
It also affects our standing internationally. In 2006, Australia was ranked 15th on the UN Index of Equality. 11 years later, by 2017, that had dropped to 35th. 3 years later, in 2020, we dropped to 44th. So actually dropping significantly and quicker as we go along. So the more we talk about equality, the less equal we're actually getting.
And while Australia scores highly in educational attainment, we still know that there's a lot more work to be done in economic participation, opportunity and political empowerment. Female-dominated industries such as childcare, aged care, healthcare, and in the community services space have been historically undervalued. Australian women are overrepresented in part-time work and in low-paid industries, and this is often insecure work. Australian women are also highly unrepresented in leadership roles, and we spoke about this before, in both the private and in the public sector. And as of 2016, over 1 million Australian workers are able to take leave and enjoy other protections because of domestic violence clauses in their workplace agreement or award conditions. So after 2016, we started to see a change,
Absolutely.
which is a good indication that we're starting to move in the right direction. Interestingly, if you think about current COVID pandemic, a lot of these things were coming up with the shutdown of services. You know, we were hearing loud and clear how this was going to impact women because they were in those insecure, part-time, casual, underpaid jobs. Now, Mike, would you like to introduce the next video?
Danny Blay, Boys Will Be Boys. Title really speaks for itself. Watch this TED Talk. It was a TEDx down in St Kilda in Melbourne. Well worth the look.
My name's Danny Blay. I've worked in the prevention of violence against women and family violence for about 17 years now, and the topic of the TED Talks today, When Dark Meets Light, really resonated with me in terms of my work being preventing family violence, the notion of family being kind of the centre of a lot of those relationships and the work that we do. There are lots of different descriptions of men. We know that men are overwhelmingly responsible for family violence, but what is it that we actually know about the men that we're working with, or men in general? Well, when we ask men, or you look up definitions of masculinity, for example, there are lots of phrases that come to mind that we readily try and attribute and hang our hat on in terms of how do we define your average bloke in our community. Men will talk about being the provider and the protector of their family and their friends, about being loyal. The notion of mateship is very strong in our community, whatever it means. Men will talk about being brave. Men will talk about being practical. We'll talk about them being heroic in terms of protecting their family, about being out there and taking risks to ensure that people are safe, or even take risks for their own enjoyment. Men will talk about being efficient, about being able to do things, a can-do kind of approach, about being practical, being resourceful, about not having to rely on other people, about being a positive male role model for other people, particularly young people, something, again, that's very much in the language that we use when we're talking about families and relationships. But there is a whole lot of other different kinds of descriptors about men and masculinity that we don't necessarily always hear about. In working in men's behaviour change programs, men will ask the men, tell us about the man you are. And men will generally be quite honest about some of the things that they see in themselves that they're not particularly proud of. Men will sometimes talk about being irresponsible or a bit too competitive, about being argumentative, about taking entrenched positions, digging a hole for themselves and not really knowing how to get out and not wanting to get out, not being a great negotiator around some of those things, about feeling bulletproof, about being infallible, about being quite garrulous, talkative, talking over people, not really wanting to listen to other people's arguments, or being quite inconsiderate, being restless, not being able to be at peace by themselves, need to be doing stuff all the time, but sometimes being irritable, sometimes being quite angry, sometimes being a bit childish when it comes to those kinds of interactions around irritability and anger, and sometimes using violence. These are some of the things that the men will tell us in men's behaviour change programs. Yet the list before is the man they want to be. They're two quite different lists. They're two different groups of characteristics. And we ask the men, how do you want to achieve being the man you want to be, rather than the way in which you see yourself now? So what is it about the men in our community? What do we know about them? We know that as I mentioned before, men are overwhelmingly responsible for violence against women and family violence, but what else do we know about the men in our community that we don't really see? Well, for example, alleged Australian offenders last year, people who broke the law, there were over 177,000 men, yet there was only about 45,000 women. In prisons last year in Australia, there were more than 31,000 men locked up, compared to about 2,500 women. Driving on the roads, men are 4 to 5 times more likely to die on the roads than women. If you're riding a motorcycle in Australia and you unfortunately die, you almost exclusively are going to be male. Twice as many boys are suspended or expelled from school than girls. 98% of sex offenders in this country and elsewhere are male. And family violence. We know that men are overwhelmingly responsible for it, much more than women's use of violence themselves. So we need to really explore some of that stuff and find out what is it that's proving this huge gender difference. The violence against women is endemic in our country and it's endemic everywhere, but there are lots of myths and excuses around what that looks like, and it's important that we try and get some perspective around it. So what does family violence and violence against women look like in Victoria and in Australia? Well, last week Victoria Police released their annual crime stats. There was over 68,000 reports of family violence to Victoria Police, almost exclusively men using violence in the home. There were more than 130,000 women in Australia last year who experienced violence from a male partner or former partner. Violence against women is the leading contributor to illness and preventable death for women under the age of 45. Compared to many of the well-known preventable risk factors like smoking and obesity and high blood pressure. It cost us $14.7 billion to our economy in Australia a couple of years ago. It's obviously much higher than that even now. And 1 in 3 women will experience violence from a male partner or former partner sometime in their life. 1 in 3. I remember hearing that stat for the first time when I was first learning about this stuff. And I immediately reflected on the 1 in 3 women in my life, 1 in 3 women in my family, the girls I went to school with, at university, socially, down the street, in the supermarket, at the footy, wherever it might be. It's a frightening number of people. And the biggest one, the pointy end, the kind of end game for a lot of this behaviour, in Australia, around about 1 woman a week dies at the hands of their male partner or former partner. Every week. This year, it's nudging 2 a week. So why is it happening? What is going on with these blokes? Why is there such a huge gender divide in terms of violence in intimate relationships and families? Well, there's lots of myths and excuses around this stuff. And it's a lot of stuff that I think we try and keep hold of and we grab onto because it makes us feel a little bit better. As I mentioned before, the newspaper is full of stories about these monsters who've killed women recently and over the past few years. And it's much easier for us to say, oh, it's those people over there, those guys are nuts, they're monsters, they're psychopaths. It's got nothing to do with me. So a lot of those myths are quite helpful for us to kind of contextualise it, but really it's not particularly helpful because the data and the research tells us something quite different. Men don't use violence towards women because they get drunk or they're using drugs. It's not about their culture. It's not because they get stressed. It's not in their biology. It's not in their genes. It's not because they all had an unhappy childhood or there wasn't a positive male role model in their lives at the time. A lot of people believe that some women deserve it because they push the buttons. They started it. Some people say that some women even enjoy it. I mean, after all, if she didn't enjoy it, if she wasn't happy about it, why doesn't she just leave? We know it's extremely complicated and difficult and risky for women to leave violent relationships. And we talk about anger. Men just get angry. Some guys just lose the plot. They have a brain fade, they have a brain snap, and they do something stupid. And yes, they regret it afterwards and they feel very remorseful for it, but they can't help it. It's just the way they're constructed. It's just the way they're built. They're hardwired to do it. The notion of anger in this context is really interesting. What we know about anger is that it's an emotion, like hundreds of other emotions that we human beings experience. And all of us experience anger at some time or another. But nobody ever got hurt from somebody feeling an emotion. People get hurt from experiencing a behaviour from somebody else. Lots and lots of people get angry. Most people don't use violence. Lots of men use violence towards their partners, not out of anger. What we do know is violence is a behaviour, and it's the behaviour that we need to be focused on in terms of prevention. We can talk all we like about how angry some men might be getting, but we know that in certain circumstances, they're not going to use violence. We know this by talking to the guys. They'll say, you know, oh, she just pushed my buttons and she nags me and I lost the plot and I just did something really stupid. So, okay. And I'll ask them, so who else have you used violence towards? So what do you mean? Oh, well, when's the last time you hit your boss? Hit my boss? Yeah, when's the last time you punched out your boss? Well, I can't do that. No, why not? Well, because I'll get fired and I'll probably get arrested and charged and might get convicted. And that's really interesting. So there's some consequences to your violence if you were to hit your boss or the police officer or a magistrate or the big burly bouncer out the front of the SB. So what's the consequence to your violence in the home? What's your consequence to the violence towards your female partner? And, as I mentioned before, because this stuff happens behind closed doors, more often than not, there isn't a consequence. We're getting much better at reporting, we're getting much better at police responses, but still most of it remains hidden. And men, by their own reports, can be very good at using violence in particular circumstances and in particular ways that's going to make it undetectable. Men will talk about using physical violence in a certain way that women won't be showing bruises and cuts if they're out on the street. So there is a choice there. That can be quite confronting for a lot of the guys that we work with because they've come to this point saying, I don't have a choice in this. This is being imposed on me. It's just the way I'm built. But they're able to readily identify ways and circumstances when they don't use violence, when they choose to not use violence at all. So when we start presenting a different way of thinking that violence is a choice and behaviour is a choice, it can be quite motivating to change ways. But only if we do a lot of more prevention work and a lot more exploratory work about finding out what the real motivations are for using violence towards women actually is. We talk to men about taking responsibility for all of their behaviour, that they can try and blame all those myths and excuses as much as they like. But ultimately, we are all responsible for everything that we do. Nobody's making us do anything that we don't want to do. So, why are men using violence? The research is really quite clear now, and it's really quite useful in terms of understanding the motivations for men using violence towards women. The greatest predictor of men's violence towards women is not those myths and excuses, but it's attitudes and beliefs and values about women, about gender, about relationships, about family, about entitlement. An entitlement based on me being a bloke. I'm entitled to certain things and therefore I'm going to achieve those certain things. Now, it might not be a completely conscious kind of conversation, internalised conversation, but the research is really clear that some of those boxes are ticked in terms of what men believe women's role is and what men's roles are, then that will certainly inform men's use of violence down the track. The biggest motivator around those values, attitudes and beliefs is around male privilege, and introducing that conversation to men who use violence or many other people just in the community can be quite confronting, and there can be a lot of resistance. Privilege? What are you talking about privilege? I haven't got any privilege. I've got to work just like everybody else. I've got to put food on the table just like everybody else. What kind of privilege do you think I'm talking about? Again, the research is really clear about male privilege in terms of very genuine differences between the genders in everyday life circumstances. If I was to apply for a job and I was competing against women who were equally qualified and experienced, statistically, I'm more likely to get the job. When I go to work, I have to invest far less effort and money into my attire and my grooming regime than women do. I'll be far less judged by those characteristics. If I get married, no one's going to ask me or question whether I'm going to change my name or not. No one's going to ask me about my work-life balance if I have children. If I choose to not have children, no one's going to question my masculinity. If I do have children, no one's going to question their surname if it's not mine. If I do have children, chances are that my female partner is going to do the most repetitive, boring and dirty chores compared to me. If I do have children, chances are the boys that I have will receive more attention and will be encouraged to be a lot more active and sometimes even aggressive than the girls. At school, as a child, boys will receive more attention than girls. If I muck up my driving or my finances, it's not going to be attributed to my gender, nor is it going to be queried what time of the month it is. If I have sex with lots of women, I'm not going to be labelled anything like what women might be in the similar situation. If I am at work, it is far less likely I'm going to be sexually harassed. There are lots of very specific activities that we engage in every single day where men are privileged due to our circumstances, due to our socialisation and what we've experienced. But the greatest male privilege is that I have the privilege of being completely unaware of my male privilege. I don't even have to think about it. I can just scoot along through life doing normal things that normal blokes do and not even have to worry about it. But it's something that women engage with and consider all the time. Women are exposed to the differences in the ways in which men can sometimes be privileged more than women. The way that men will quite often speak over women in a meeting or in a conversation, unlike women will do, and not even think about it, not be aware of it. So what do we do about that? Well, it's vital as men that we have the conversation with ourselves about how am I privileged compared to the girls and the women in my life? How are the other boys and men in my life privileged compared to the girls and women in my life? We need to really refuse to engage in the myth that boys will be boys. There is no evidence to suggest that there is enormous differences between the genders based on biology or chemistry or genetics. This is all socialised stuff. This is what we learn from day one. We need to develop our empathy. In working in men's behaviour change programs, we'll often ask the question of the men, how did she feel when you did or said that? And so, I don't know. You'll have to ask her. So if you did know, what would she say? And he does know, because that's the reason why he's used that behaviour. He knows precisely what the impact is because he's got away with it. We need to do that thing that we sometimes colloquially call walk a mile in her shoes. What's her experience when you're doing that stuff, saying those things, using that behaviour, making those decisions for her, not letting her have her own, making her own decisions and have her own rights in the same way that you do? We need to ask how we are using our own male privilege, our social privilege above others, and whether we need to concede some stuff to ensure that the girls and the women in our lives have an equitable chance of living their lives at the same levels as we do. We need to challenge that myth about boys will be boys, and maybe then we can stop family violence, and we can stop men's violence towards women, and we can bring some light into the dark. Cheers.
So we asked you previously in this session a question, and that question was, gender inequality across society can increase the severity of or frequency of violence against women.
Having watched Danny's video, which pulls together the threads of those discussions,
Do you still believe this to be true or false? And now we want to wrap up the session by just going back to some of those gender drivers of violence against women. And
having a look at how those stereotypes drive the inequality against women. We've looked at how stereotypes construct these images and pictures and forms of masculinity and femininity. Boys are supposed to be like this and girls are supposed to be like this. What that does at the same time is entrench men's control. entrenched men's control of decision making, and it limits females' independence. We see it at all levels of society. We see it in the family home where wait till your father gets home and other comments are made, or where the expectation is placed on the woman who might be working full time to also do the bulk of the domestic work in the house. That doesn't quite stack up. Or the man who needs to go off and play golf, leaving the woman at home with the child. It also goes into our level of politics, where not much more needs to be said, but that Tony Abbott appointed himself as the Minister for Women because I think he thought he knew most about them. We'll leave that for you. Our next session will be why don't people just leave? If life is that bad, why don't people just leave the situation they're in? If people are so unequal or victimised in their homes, why don't they just leave? It's a simple question. It's not a simple answer.